Hey guys, what is up? It is Kristen, and I have a video for you today on covering arrays and for loops and how to visualize the process of how this happens in C++. So I'm going to jump into what we do when we're using a one-dimensional array. So how do we set up a 1D array in C++? So over here, the first thing I want you to notice is that I have declared some variable for the size of the array, which will be the max number of elements that the array can contain. So here I am declaring an integer type array. So this is an array called A, which will hold nothing but integers, and it will be based on the variable size. So it will allocate the amount of space for 5 element positions for integer size. And what we're doing here is we're using a for loop to initialize our array values. So what you can see here is that the for loop takes basically 3 parts to its parentheses arguments. So the first thing here is that we're declaring an iterative value, which we're going to call I. And what this does is it keeps track of the position in the array as we are traversing it in an iterative fashion. And so we're going to start at we're going to declare some iterative value. We're going to set it equal to its start position. The second part here, in the middle of the for loop argument, is showing what the terminating condition of the loop is going to be. And that's going to be when I reaches the max value of the final position, the last element in the array, whichever way you want to think of it. And that is going to be the value of size minus 1. So if we start at a position of 0 in our array, the max that we can go to is 1 less than 5, which is going to be 4. And the last part here is the I++, which is adding 1 or incrementing I every time that the for loop goes down and comes back up again. Inside of here, what we're doing is we're saying that at A, in the I position of wherever we are in A, we're going to set some value based on what I is currently valued at, plus 1, and then multiply that by 10. So to give you an idea of when I is 0, this would be 0. We're going to add 1, so we get 1 times 10. So our A of 0 will have the value of 10. And the next thing we're doing here is we're doing a function call by passing A and its size to a function. Up here, we have a void function, which is going to be an example of how we pass an array in C++. One thing to note is that when you pass an array, you are passing a reference to its location in memory, not a copy of it, like a variable copy. So sometimes before you might have noticed that we can take a variable and rename it, and we'll pass it into a scope. It'll be used in that scope, but it'll be labeled in a new box. And we're not copying a variable and giving it a new name here. We are actually accessing its permanent location wherever it was declared in memory. So in this for loop, you can say that we can reuse I over again because it is conditional to the scope of a single for loop. And we're going to start at the 0 position and go to the final element position of size minus 1. And what we're going to do is we're going to print out whatever is stored in the array A at its ith position, whatever that may be. So to give you an idea of what's going on here, let's run this with debugger. So I'm going to set debugger here, and I'm going to run the code. So the first thing that's going to happen is that you'll notice that we are passing the address of A in memory and its size, which are seen in scope. And you can see that I is starting out at a value of 0. And as we go through, we're printing the contents. And we saw here that we got the value of 10 from A of 0. Now that A is 1, we should get the value of 20 because we're taking 1 plus 1, which is 2, times 10 is 20. And that's how we're getting these values. And that's going to keep going until we reach the size. Notice right now I is 4, out becomes 5, and we immediately terminate. We're down at the end of the scope of our function, and we are returning back to main to where the function call occurred. So that's an example of using a for loop to loop through a one-dimensional array in C++. Now, the next thing I'd like to show you is how to deal with printing a two-dimensional array or a grid in C++. 2D arrays are a little bit more complex, and in this example I'm going to print using a double for loop. A double for loop is a loop that's nested within a loop, and to visualize what's going on here, if a single for loop is executing on a 1D array, you can imagine this as a series of boxes lined up in a linear fashion, where you're accessing the first one to the next one to the next one until you hit the end of the row of boxes. With a 2D array or a grid, what you're doing is you're accessing both a row and a column of information, kind of like an Excel document. And what you can see here is that we have an outer for loop and an inner for loop. The outside loop will be dependent on the size of the columns, and the inside loop will be dependent on the size of the rows. So every time that we iterate once for the outer for loop, we are iterating all the way through from 0 to the size of the row for one value of the outside iteration. So if we loop here for 5 times until we hit size, this will go through 5 times before I ever reaches 1. This will terminate, will go up, I will become 1, and then we'll loop through until we hit 5 again, printing out some other line again. So to show you how this works, we're going to run through it in debugger. So I'm going to set a breakpoint here. I'm going to set my size here to 10, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to, all right, there we go. So the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to go in and start stepping through the code. You can see that right now I and j are set to 0 and size is 10. We're going to start printing what's going to be on the first line of information. And notice here on the side that I is 0, but j is being increased. So j gets increased until it reaches the size specified for the line before I ever gets increased once. So at this point, we're on the last pass through our loop. We've finally hit size, so we've terminated the inside for loop on the first iteration. And now we're going to do some prints, and now I has officially started its second loop. So our outside for loop has finished one time, and the inside for loop has finished every time to size for one iteration of the outside loop. And you can see here that we've printed one line of information from going through this. And the process at this point just continues until I finally reaches size. So if we were to take this off, you'll see that what we get is a series of rows where each row is the information on the line, and each column is the number of rows that we are printing in succession. So to take this a step further, I want to show you how you can pass in a 2D array and deal with printing the values stored within a 2D array. So here we're declaring a 2D array called B, and we're specifying its size in both a row and a column. And this is going to be a simple 4x4 style array, and we're passing B here. Notice that B is already in scope, so we don't have to pass the other pieces of information here. One thing to note is that you don't necessarily have to specify the first bracket of information when you're passing in an array, a 2D array, but you do have to specify the number of columns, because that is the outside loop max size, which is going to determine basically how many times the whole 2D array would have to be accessed in general. So let's go here to our 2D array print function and run this. The first thing I want you to notice here is that it's very similar to before, where we have columns on the outside and rows on the inside. And what we're doing is we're creating a variable for a value based on the position of j, so this is the row position, plus 1 times 10. And we're going to set that value equal to some location within the 2D array at b of I of j. And this is the syntax for accessing an element stored within a two-dimensional array. So before we could only do it with the I position, but now we have to specify both the I and the j position, the row and the column, in order to access the value in a double for loop. So to run this code, we're going to put a breakpoint. We're going to run it. And I'm going to save my stuff, come back up here, and we're going to run it again. And here what I'm doing is I'm passing in a value of 4 and 4 here and setting just two variables so it's easier for me to read when I'm looking at the iterations. You can see here that we're passing the memory address of B and the row and the column are both specified. So as we go in here, you can see that I and j both start at 0, and we are giving a value to the variable value, assigning it to the location in the array, and then we're going to print what is going on. So you can see here that j is going to reach size when it reaches the value of 4. So this will be our last assignment before we finish. We just terminated the inside for loop of the first iteration. And now we're up checking on the second I value. I is now officially 1, so our outside loop has started its second iteration. And you can see here that we started printing as well. So we've printed the first line of information, and this will continue to run this way for the rest of the 2D array. And this is an example of how you fill up information in a 2D array with values and print them. So I hope that this brief overview of dealing with arrays, both one-dimensional and two-dimensional, and for loops in general, has helped you with some deeper understanding of fundamentals when dealing with your problems in CSCI 1300 here at City of Boulder. Well, that's all I've got for you guys for today. Thanks, and I'll see you guys next time.